Gimel in going through the Mishnayot. And the one that I picked for us is from the Mishnah of Peah, the 5th chapter, the first one. It starts with a Gadish Shelo Leket Tachtav. So we're talking about the mitzvah of Leket. Leket is one of the various gifts that are given to the poor. You have, of course, Peah, leaving the corners of your field for the widow and the orphan. You have Leket and Shichacha are very similar. Leket is if you drop something on the ground, you don't go back and pick it up. There's an argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. What does it mean you can't go back? If you've dropped a lot, you can go back. The argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is between 2 and 3. Beit Hillel says if you drop 2, you don't go back for it, but if you drop 3, the owner of the field is allowed. That's a significant amount. You can pick up the 3. Beit Shammai says no. It's somewhat surprising that Beit Shammai seems to be more lenient in this regard, at least from the point of view of the farmer. He says if you, point of view of the poor person, he says if you drop 3, you leave that already for the poor person. Only when it's 4 that you drop, you can go back and get. Shechacha is very similar. The difference is sheaves, right? If you've already bundled together sheaves of, let's say, wheat or corn, things along those lines, and you left behind 2 of those, and you just forgot to pick them up, or 3 of those, then you leave for the poor person. There's a parallel mitzvot for trees. It's not 100% clear exactly if it's the right or Rabbanan, but like with regards to trees, if you're harvesting a bunch of trees, the assumption is that it is directed for olives and not for other trees, and you forget, and it happens. I've been up to the field. Sometimes you're beating the trees to get the olives down, and all the trees look the same, and you forgot one of the trees. And when you realize at the end you forgot doing one of the trees, you have to leave that behind for the poor to be able to take care of that. So there's a series of mitzvot to help the poor sustain themselves. So if you have a group of leket, you forgot, or it fell, and you have the leket, the 2 or 3, right, are left on the ground, and then you have a big pile of other things that you're harvesting, and they fell on top of the leket. So that's the case. You don't know really what is leket, because it's underneath this whole big supply of other things, or how do they translate it as a pile of grain. So it's stacked on part of the field, and gleanings had not yet been collected from that. So you have no idea how much leket is actually under there. So in that case, how do you determine? Anything on that bottom layer is for the poor person. We don't believe that everything on the bottom layer was leket. We don't believe that you dropped all those things. It's all gleanings. But nevertheless, since we don't know what is, in fact, leket and which is not, you've hidden it already by putting a big pile on the place where there might have been leket. There's no way for you to determine how much is actually down there. So we say that anything that touched the ground, that's for the poor person. So most likely they're going to get more than they otherwise would have gotten, because it's a case of uncertainty, and in case of uncertainty, we favor the poor person. A similar case, haruach shepizra et ha'aramim, you have different piles of your grain, and the wind comes and blows it all over, and it's blown all over the field. And at this point in time, if it's blown all over the field, you don't know which was blown from your pile and which was leket. You had already been harvesting, and you had dropped it. Omdimota kama leket hi ruya lasot. So what do you do in that case? There's no way for you to determine exactly how much gleanings were left, so you make an estimate. You estimate how much would this field normally have if, you remember from the years past how much leket was, so that's how much you have to give then for the poor person. V'noten la'anim, and you give it to the poor person. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer, noten la'anim b'chtei nefilah. He gives us a different standard. We'll explain his different standard in just a moment, but what we know is that he rejects the idea that you should estimate how much leket you give to a poor person. He doesn't believe that you should estimate. There should be a standard that is the same always. It's not a surprise that he makes this statement. I brought for you some of these statements from the first chapter in Pirkei Avot. We'll get to Shammai in a moment, but you see, right after Shammai speaks, Rabban Gamliel is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's father. So Rabban Gamliel says, Haya Omer, Aseh lecha Rav, make sure you make for yourself a Rav. There's a machloket about how Homiletically, we often interpret it as Aseh lecha rav, make yourself a rav. Make sure that you try to engage in enough learning that you can be sophisticated in halachic decision making. But the pshat is you should always have a rabbi that you can turn to ask for halachic questions. Don't leave it up to chance. In that same theme, vistalek min hasafik, remove yourself from doubt. Right? There's a lot of doubt in this world, but in any instance where you can remove your self-doubt, do a little extra work, whether it's speaking to the rabbi or doing your own additional research or clarifying matters, you should be able to do that. You should try to, there's something valuable in being exact and being knowledgeable on any particular issues. The al tarbe la'aser omdot. And don't increase in tithing by estimation. Okay, it's a little bit of a odd language because if you look down below, the Tosafot Yom Tov has a problem with the word the al tarbeh. Don't increase la'aser amdot in your estimation of tithing. You could have just said, don't estimate in tithing, but he says don't increase in your tithing. So I think here the pshat is as well. Sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes you have to estimate, but don't make it a habit. Try your best always to be exact as possible, weigh things out, count things out, things along those lines. The Tosafot Yom Tov gives a different explanation. He says the reason what the word tarbeh adds to this is even if you're increasing your tithing, right? When you estimate, sometimes you estimate incorrectly, too high, and sometimes you estimate incorrectly too low. So he says even if you're accustomed to estimating too high, which you would think would be a good thing for a poor person, still don't do that. Don't do that because it will eventually lead to mistakes anyway, once you get a habitual to tithing in such a way. He also says from a halakhic point of view, don't do it because your tithing is now still in the realm of safek. It's not a vadai tithe, even though you're giving more. And so it's better to be exact in those instances as well. So this is Rabbi Gamliel who says, don't estimate your tithing. So it makes sense that his son, Shimon, the next Pirkei Avot, Shimon ben Omer, his son is Shimon. By the way, interesting, this is the first time I think we have the appellation of Beno, his son. And I read a commentary, I can't remember where, that points out that actually amongst the rabbis, it's their children very often did not agree halachically always with their fathers. And so this appellation of Shimon Beno, his son, no, he actually followed his father quite seriously on a whole series of issues. And therefore, when he makes a statement, it's probably something that he heard from his father as well. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things we can say, and I just want to remind, maybe Peter, you're good at this usually. Is that 5 o'clock? I just heard a beep.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet. Okay.
It's 1 minute before.
Okay, so give me 2 minutes, before 5:07. Let me know. Okay, so as I said, there's a lot of different things we can say from the point of view of the importance of taking care of the poor. But I want to show two sort of arguments that exist within this Mishnah. But you should bear in mind, I think the fundamental message is the concern that one should have for the poor, and that this Mishnah brings. The first argument is something that the Rambam says. The Rambam says that when it comes to practicing this mitzvah today, it's already in his times, he says we don't really do leket. And the reason why is the verse says you shall leave the gleanings for the poor. In the same way you leave Peah for the poor, so you leave it for the poor to take. And he says in his day already, the poor did not come out to the farms. The farms were not, where everyone lived. Jews had become more of a, it's hard to imagine because it's so much more so today, but already in his time they had become urban dwellers. They weren't so much based in agriculture. And so therefore, already in his day, people were not coming out to collect their leket. And he says you have no mitzvah to pick the gleanings for them and then bring it to the poor person. Rabbi Akiva Eger actually disagrees. He says even if the poor people are not coming, you still have a mitzvah of leaving it for them, and he goes out of his way in a whole series of different halachic opinions of making sure you get the food actually to the poor person. It's not just only if they need it, but you actually have to go out of your way, and he may have his own personal historical experiences, when I read a little bit about Rabbi Eger's life, he was always very concerned for the poor. In fact, just a couple years before he passed away, he became famous for writing letters Erev Yom Kippur, meaning people do a lot of things Erev Yom Kippur, they're getting ready for the day. He was known for writing letters to other communities that were basically fundraising letters. In his small community, cholera had a huge outbreak. People were dying in great numbers. He's written very powerfully about how it came, and the language is very powerful about the death and the pain. And he wrote to the wealthiest communities in his day, in Amsterdam and London, begging for financial support, primarily for food, because he says when people are starving already, then cholera has even a more deadly impact on their lives. When he married actually someone quite wealthy, but there was a terrible fire in the town where they lived, and his father-in-law's wealth was destroyed. And so he had to go with his wife to a new town. He took up a job as a pulpit rabbi that paid him very, very little. And there's stories of a couple times where he tried to, upgrade, and he would go to maybe another community, and his host community would not let him go, and they wouldn't raise his salary at all. So perhaps he had a certain sensitivity there. Whatever the basis of their debate is, the Rambam's halacha seems to win the day. That there is no mitzvah to go out of your way. There's a mitzvah to leave it, but the poor actually has to come and collect it. And Rav David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, says this is the Torah's way in general. The Torah doesn't want to get involved in giving a specific sort of economic policy. What it wants to do, it actually has both sides to it. You have obviously a socialist element of providing the shichacha, the leket, the peah, all these don't loan on interest, and shmita, canceling debts, yovel, returning. You have obviously these big concerns taking place, but he also points out that there's an element of sort of self-sufficiency that the Torah is requesting. The poor person has to go out, and they have to work for the gifts that the wealthy are giving them. There is sort of a partnership almost taking place, says Rav David Halevi. So you have both of those things together. Okay, let's just now look at the second machloket that appears, and that's this machloket of estimation, right? So the first opinion says you estimate how much there would be, how much would have fallen. Rabbi Shimon says, I don't want there to be any estimation, but we give a standard. And we can understand the argument on both sides, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's argument is having standards helps in a lot of things. When you can rely that everyone is going to be treated the exact same way when it comes to the legal system. And you can rely on certain, the economic system is going to work the same way. And you can rely on things taking place, and there's always a standard. That's fair. Whereas the other opinion is, well, let's make things more on an individual basis. So, for example, if you look at how Kahati understands this argument at the very bottom, he says the first opinion is that you estimate, when he says estimate, you estimate this particular field. Fields are different. Some fields are rockier. Some fields are on hills. Some fields are more difficult to collect, and if they're more difficult to harvest, you're more likely to drop more things. And other fields are very easy, and then you won't drop anything. So therefore, each field would be slightly different. Right? That's, to a certain extent, looking at the concerns of the landowner. Right? Why should he have to give more, right, leket, if it's very rare that he has any gleanings in his field, right? From his point of view. The second opinion says, no, we have one standard, and there's an actual amount. Every field, a certain amount, you're always going to give a certain amount of leket for that. That's Reb Shimon ben Gamliel's point of view. And if you think about that for a moment, this element of standardization is there, but also it's from the point of view of the poor person. What does the poor person care whether or not the farmer has a rocky field or not a rocky field? The poor person needs his food. He doesn't care where he's getting it from, and he doesn't really care if he had a good year or a bad year, the farmer, he has to figure out how much food am I going to get this year. And that seems to be potentially, so Scotty's, the real basis of the argument. And one of the things that I think interesting there is, there's this old joke about there once was like a very serious hunger situation taking place in a particular community, and the rabbi said we have to raise all this money before Pesach in order to provide food for all the poor. And he got up one day in shul and he said, I have good news and bad news. I've been successful in 50% of our campaign. I've convinced the poor people to take the money. Now I need to convince the rich to give the money. From every point of view, from every time you have a situation, there's two sides. There's what the poor need and what will help the wealthy in order to give. There's another argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. I'll just say it very quickly. I alluded to it already. That might sort of shine a little insight into this particular argument. So I mentioned that Beit Hillel says that if 2 sheaves are left, right, you leave them. But if 3, you don't leave them. And Beit Shammai says, no, even if you leave 3, only when it's 4 do you have to you pick them up, but 3 you can leave nevertheless. What's the basis of their argument? What's really taking place? So one possibility is that Beit Hillel is saying we're trying to cultivate a certain personality in the farmer, in the wealthy individual, that he might just say, listen, I've left things on the field, they're my property, I want to collect everything as much as possible. And Hillel is saying, no, listen, you know what? Something insignificant. Don't be greedy. Don't just pick up every single thing, right? If it's significant, I understand, pick it up, fine. But every 2 things, it's nothing, leave it. Whereas Beit Shammai is now talking, well, what do the poor need? For a poor person, 3 sheaves, that's significant, that's meaningful. So leave that for them. Beit Shammai seems to be like, and that's why Shammai is the first one. Shammai, to a certain extent, even though Rabban Gamliel is the grandson of Hillel, he seems to be a student of Shammai. Shammai is saying, let's have a standard. Let's worry about the poor, how we're going to get them fed. And Hillel is going from, I want to try to cultivate a certain personality amongst the wealthy, that they are they're having a spiritual moment, and they're thinking about the needs of the poor. Where do you focus your concerns with? Setting the standard or setting sort of a aspirational goal of trying to convince people to think differently about relating to other people? What's, I think, nice about Mishnah in general is that both opinions are preserved. Not because we don't have a halakha at the end of the day that you have to do one thing, but at the end of the day, there's a value in seeing both sides of the same argument. And if you think about our learning in general, you always have all the opinions preserved, even the minority opinions. I mentioned in shul a few weeks ago, the Rambam wanted his Mishnah Torah not to have any sources, not to have any footnotes. This is the halacha. You don't need to know anything else, but just what I'm writing here now in the Mishnah Torah. And the great revenge is his biggest critics, right? The Ravid and they're all on the page, meaning all of the people who disagree with the Rambam are still in the page, and that's how we learn. We learn with a majority opinion, we learn with a minority opinion, we preserve everything because there's a value in sort of mixing up those various opinions together.